Hello and welcome. In this video we are going to build ourselves a slimagotchi. There are a few things you're going to need to begin. You're going to need a WaveShare V2 display. You are going to need a spool of solder, some solder wick or desoldering braid. You're going to need a 40-pin header, Raspberry Pi Zero, W, some pair of pliers, and a pair of locking pliers. To begin with here, we are going to be removing the 8-pin connector from the back of the board. The reason we're going to remove the 8-pin header is so that we can get a bit more height out of the Panagotchi. You can see how it overlaps here. My method for doing this is to snip the pins. There's 8 pins. You're going to make sure you snip each one individually. Alright, so with these snips, we're going to simply take them and go through and individually clip each one of the pins. You do have to be somewhat careful because this connector is not held on very well at all. The lead-free solder has tendency of just snapping right off. So that's why we need to make sure we snip it in the gap here, the groove between the board and the connector. Just snapping each one individually. You can kind of feel a little bit of give as you cut each one with the snips. Once you have the all 8 cut, you can kind of see how the connector starts pulling away from the board, as you can see here in the video. Make sure your solder iron is ready, as we're now going to come in with our soldering iron. Make sure you clean the tip. We're going to add a little bit of leaded solder to the tip of the soldering iron. So the goal here is to kind of more or less wet the connection. Once that join is wetted, you're going to want to grab your pliers, or locking pliers, as I'm going to use here in a minute. So these locking pliers are going to grab onto the connector, and you can use it to kind of pry it up off the board as you touch it with the soldering iron. As you can see here, it starts pulling away from the board as I heat the solder joint. It is now free. Alright, so here I'm going to go ahead and get the other side of this connector, and it should just fall off once it's been heated, just like that. So the next step is to remove all the remnants from the 8-pin header. Now the key here is to be very gentle. You want the braid to do the work. You do not want to force it whatsoever. Otherwise you will just tear the pad right off. Whatever PCB material this display is using, it's not the greatest. Okay, as you can see in the video here, the solder wick is wicking up the solder, and it's actually pulling along each of the individual little bits left over from the conductor. Just go ahead and remove any of the excess braid that you've already used. I'm now going to go in and just finish cleaning up this last pad. And of course, I just had to go in and try cleaning that last pad. You have a really good view of the back of my hand. Sorry about that. Yeah, the pad of course just pulled right off. But that's okay, because it's just ground and we don't really care. Right, so now we're going to go ahead and start removing the pins from the header. The way I make my slimagotchi is I like to pull the pins out, shove them into the connector, and yeah, I don't know, it just makes it a lot easier to assemble. Other people might try a couple of other different techniques. I know some people like to use a PCI slot cover to force down the little black portion of the header down. But for me personally, I prefer just to pull them out individually. It's quite tedious as there are 40 pins, so I'll skip ahead here in a minute. So now I'm going to go ahead and start inserting those pins. I'm going to put just a couple on both ends, and then I'm going to go ahead and grab my Raspberry Pi, so that way when you put the pins in, you're putting them through the PCB into the display. Otherwise, attempting to line the Raspberry Pi up with those pins to attach to together is quite difficult. As you can see, it's actually a little bit of a thing even trying to line up just these 4 pins. You could imagine a fully populated 40 pin connector. And there we go. Now it's fully seated. Now what I'm showing here in this video is that it's very, 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 very slim. Basically, you want to make sure that PCB rests all the way with that connector, totally flat. Here you can actually see just how close the screen gets to the HDMI connector. And now I've busted out the macro lens so that you can see just what it looks like when all the pins are in there and lined up. As you're seeing this, I am prepping my soldering iron for the next phase, which is to come along and actually solder these pins. Now, I only populated the majority of the pins, not all of them. I left a few here free at the end, so that way I can attach a GPS and the real-time clock. The WaveShare display doesn't actually use all of these pins. As you saw and removed earlier, the 8-pin header, it only needs those 8 pins. It really doesn't need the full complement of 40. So now I'm going to come in here with my soldering iron and attempt to solder this while looking through the camera's display. Obviously not my best work. It's far easier to solder when you don't have a camera in front of you. But I'm going to go ahead and solder this entire row for you, so that way you got some nice visual guide as to how to solder this. The rule of thumb is you basically want to heat the work and then bring in the solder. You don't necessarily want to touch the solder to the soldering iron itself, as it will make a imperfect join. You only want to heat it up for as long as necessary. You don't want to put too much time on it, but you don't want to put too little either. You know, you kind of have to get a feel for it. So basically, you come in, you heat, you touch it with the solder, boom, connection's done. It really shouldn't take much time at all to make these joins. But it's not something that can be rushed. You do have to take your time and make sure that each one has sucked in some solder. You can kind of see it here in this close-up that the solder is literally being sucked up into the connection. And that's precisely what you want your solder joints to do when you're soldering this connector yourself. Yeah, it's not easy to film this through a camera lens, or solder through a camera lens. Fortunately, I did set the focus at a specific point, so that way the camera isn't hunting for focus, as I'm sure that would be nauseating. Here, at least it gets a little out of focus, but, you know, I at least try to bring it back into focus for you. Now I'm going to go ahead and finish the rest of these off video. And that last join is not good, but I come back and I fix it later, don't worry. Okay, I've gone along and I've completed all of the joins. So the next part, of course, is to come in with your snippers and snip off the excess length. Now, I'm using a finger. What you might want to do is to make sure you're wearing some safety goggles. This is probably not a bad idea, because as you snip these, they tend to go flying at high speed. In fact, every time I snip it with my finger there, it actually gets embedded into my finger. Um, it's not the most comfortable thing on the world. You might even want to wear maybe some gloves, so that way when you snip it, it doesn't, break skin, which I've had happen a few times. So just FYI. And there we go. That was the last pin. Okay, so here's a shot of the completed pin header. Alright, so in this part here, I'm going to let this run as I talk to you. But basically what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to slimagotchi.io and download the latest version of the software. You're going to take that software and burn it to an SD card using something like Blanca Etcher. I don't have any recorded footage of doing that, but it's really easy. As long as you have a micro SD card reader for whatever computer you're going to use to burn this image to the SD card. Once you've burned it to that SD card and you've inserted it into your slimagotchi, go ahead and connect a console. I mean, that's what I'm doing here in this video. Basically, I'm using a mini HDMI to HDMI adapter, and I got it plugged into my PC for this capture. In addition, I have a micro USB OTG adapter, so I can plug in a keyboard. And as it boots here for the first time, it's going to resize the file system. This process does take a while. And all the while, your display will continue to be blank. It's a little bit concerning when you don't have a console connector. Even if you have it plugged in via USB, it's not going to show up as a USB Ethernet until it gets past all of this first portion. And you're definitely not going to be able to SSH into it until it's gone through and completed this initial phase. I would say if you're doing this headless, well, not headless, but without a console attached, it's going to take at least 5-10 minutes minimum for it to get through all of this. And a lot of this is going to be dependent upon the speed of your SD card. In this case, this is a Samsung Evo Select. It's rated for 100 megabytes per second read and about 30 megabytes for the writing. So it's fairly quick, but not the fastest you could conceivably purchase. But if you just picked a random SD card off your shelf, and it's, 5, 6 years old, it's not going to be a very fast card, and this process will take forever depending on just how large that card is. Now, in my example here, this is a 32 gigabyte card. It's going to take, well, not nearly as long as, say, like a 64 gig or even 128 gig, should you have one of those kinds of cards. This will take exponentially longer for it to resize. Fortunately, it looks like it's almost done here, and the system will finally get to the point where I can log in. At this point, your screen will still be blank, as it has not even gotten to the point where it's starting Panagotchi. And it looks like it's just initialized right there. So at this point, your display is going to flash and go blank. Of course, it was already blank, but it's going to refresh the display anyways. So this is the first indication you're going to get that your Panagotchi is alive if you don't have a console connected. So at this point, your Panagotchi is going to be alive. You are going to at least see it initialize if you have it plugged into your computer via the data port, and you should actually have the network adapter show up. So at this point, this is the first time you're going to be able to even ping it, assuming you follow the guides online for communicating it. So I'm going to go ahead and log in here and issue a few commands. Now, this is the first things I do when I'm creating a Panagotchi, is I'll go through and I'll set things like the host name and modify a couple of other settings, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do that here in a moment. Now, off camera here, what I'm doing is initially my keyboard wasn't responding. So what I did is I disconnected the OTG adapter and I reconnected it. So at this point, your Panagotchi is going to be displaying the generating keys message. So you'll see its little face, and the only thing it's going to say is, generating keys do not power off. Now, this process takes a very long time on a Raspberry Pi Zero. It's just not a fast process for it to generate these RSA keys. And it's going to look like it's not responding because there's no other messages that you're getting on its face. So the only real way to tell is when it's finally switched off of that particular message and it says something like, authenticating to something or kick banning something or something to that effect. As you can see, the Panagotchi is still actually initializing for the first time. Okay, so at this point, you would be able to SSH into it. Not exactly a quick process. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and log in and start making those changes. Now that I've got the keyboard working, that is. So default user and password is Pi with the password of Raspberry as the password, of course. So once you enter that, you'll get the initial messages. Most importantly, it tells you about the system control commands for starting and stopping the Panagotchi service, which is pretty important. The first time you log in, it does take a little bit before it gives you the actual command prompt. All right. And here we go. I'm finally entering some commands. So the configuration files for the Panagotchi are contained in /etc/Panagotchi. My usual MO is to go ahead and copy the default.yml over the top of the config.yml. This just gives us a nice baseline to work from, and it's very easy to go through and turn on features or turn off features as you see fit, versus trying to, pull out individual lines or copy and paste it or whatever other methods you may want to utilize for actually making these changes. As you can see, I added an extra U in there for some silly reason. Okay, there we go. Finally. Okay, so this is the configuration file for your Panagotchi. As you can see, the first thing I'm going to do is give it a name. So I'm using Nano here, but you could use VI or what have you in terms of actually editing this file. I know some other individuals actually pull the SD card, plug it into their Linux-based PC in order to modify these files, but I prefer to do it from the console. Mainly because I have the cables laying around and it's not a big deal. So some of these lines control some interesting things like whether or not you want it to automatically update if it has an active internet connection, whether or not it reports to the pawn grid, which is kind of neat. That's how people get on the little status boards and leaderboards in terms of the most networks pwned and those kind of things. I usually leave those at default, but I do have a couple that I have actively report the number of networks pwned, just because it's funny. But this is how you can also turn on things like the GPS function and many, many other features. This is also what you'd have to modify if you wanted to enable the Bluetooth tether functions, which is something I haven't tried ever, mainly because I don't like Bluetooth. If I can avoid using it, I do. The one thing I will turn on in here is the memtemp. This is what displays the temperatures and CPU loads of the Panagotchi, which is pretty useful to know in terms of how it's behaving and how its health is. Because these displays are sensitive to heat. Around 50 degrees Celsius, you'll start getting artifacting and it'll start getting darker and darker as it heats up. And at some point, even refreshes are just a temporary fix before it goes gray and dark again. So it's pretty important to keep an eye on that temperature and try to keep it at a reasonable, 25, maybe 30 degrees Celsius. Occasionally, it can get up to about 40 degrees depending on the ambient temperature. What I'm going to do now is go ahead and head down to where you can determine whether or not it performs deauth attacks. I tried to be a kind neighbor and I turned that off. Also, so it doesn't de-authenticate any of my own personal devices as I'm trying to, game with friends online or watch videos. Okay, so it looks like I'm going to go ahead and save out the file. So that's Control O for writing it out, and then I do a Control X to exit Nano. Okay, and so now I'm going to pull up HTOP so that way you can see the amount of load that the Panagotchi is still under. As you can see, it is still generating those RSA keys as indicated with the command there that's running at the top, which is pwn-grid-generate-keys. So that takes some time for it to finish. It is not a fast process. And basically, I mean, here you go. This is Panagotchi. This is how it's made. This is what it's doing when you can't tell what it's doing. I primarily wanted to make this video so that others can learn and make a little Panagotchi family of their own. As indicated by what I named this is my 8th Panagotchi. I have a lot of them. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'm going to let HTOP run here in the background as I sign off, but enjoy.